You're listening to the Vent Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vent Podcast. My name is Brady, joined in studio once again by Billy Galanko. Billy, you look radiant today. How are you?
Excellent. Great to have you back. For those who missed, we had an episode last week, but Brady was traveling all last week. So it's great to have him back in action.
Yeah, we're up in Vermont, Burlington, Vermont for a little bit, a little vacation. Spent a day in Montreal, Canada, my first time in Canada. It was a cool little French town, which, I was super surprised at how much like parts of Paris Montreal was. And apparently it's one of the 3 or 4 or 5 main locations that they use for shooting, like in Hollywood, if they can't do something in Paris. So it's interesting.
Wow, that is really cool. Yeah. And we'll loosely touch on this later, but I am following quickly behind him, not copying Brady, but we're going to Montreal and Vermont this weekend. So we'll have more on that, I guess.
Yeah, we like to go to the same places, just not together, right?
Not at the same time. Yeah. Yeah. But we do have a really exciting guest. Another thing that I'm copying Brady on this week, the founders from the farm out in Paso. Brady, you want to share a little bit up front about why we're having them? And then I guess we can share more right before we dive in about why they're so special.
Yeah, I was actually just trying to think of how I first found out about Jim Madsen and the farm. And then we also have Santiago on as well, who is the founder of Matervini in Mendoza, but Jim and Santiago are good friends, have been for a long time. I'm trying to remember how I first found out about the farm. I think it was through a Central Coast Facebook group. Someone posted about their allocation to this winery, this it's not a cab blend, but their flagship Cabernet, Old Vine Cabernet wine someone had posted about. And I thought the label art was really interesting because they have these beautiful labels with an old barn on the front. There they are. Billy's holding it up for our video watchers. And so I checked it out, and super small production. It's like a cult winery without the cult following. I think you said, Billy, recently, and hopefully there is more of a following. I'm trying to give them a little bit more airtime. Jim and Santiago have history going back, I think, to graduate school at Stanford together, like we'll talk about on the interview, and caught the wine bugs in different ways at different times. And Santiago is a dedicated and fabulous winemaker, both from the science of winemaking, but also I think they both have a really great feel for wine and viticulture in general and bring that knowledge to both of these projects. Yeah, it's a great conversation, one we've actually been trying to have for several months.
Yeah. So we'll dive in a little bit more of their background right before we start the interview. But yeah, Jim is a podcast listener and actually connected with us after an episode. So we're really excited to have them on, and we'll share a little bit more. I'll talk about the wine that I held up, hopefully, because they were nice enough to send a couple free bottles our way after the episode, which was great. Prior to getting into that, I want to talk a little bit about a tasting that I had done last weekend. We'll do the kind of what we're drinking this weekend. While you were in Montreal or Vermont, did you have any wine by chance or anything of interest?
Yeah, I think I had a red wine. I believe it was Piemonte something. I actually didn't pay attention to it at all. I just ordered it with a pasta dish that we had at an Italian place, which is not really I would normally do, but I just asked him to bring me whatever he thought would go well with it and didn't really ask too much follow-up. It was a great meal. It was a great wine. Other than that, we stopped at a little winery and did a tasting, had some Cheval Blanc. It was one of these just off the road, and I can't even come to the name of it right now. We should do some prep for this podcast.
Some of us do.
That's right. But it was Cheval Blanc, which admittedly I haven't had a ton of. It was good. And I was hoping for some late harvest or maybe like some ice wine type bottles, but didn't find anything that suited. I did pick up several of our friend David Keck's wines, Stella 14 wines, at a local wine shop there outside of Burlington. So yeah, I did come back with a little bit of a haul, even though we didn't do much tasting.
Nice. I did a couple mini tastings this weekend, and I'm also back on studying fortifieds. So I tasted a bunch of those. But the first, I guess I wasn't really going to mention this one, but I was at one of our local wine bars, and it was founded by a guest that we're actually going to have now coming on in November, which is really exciting. I've wanted to have him for a while, but it was from Piemonte as well. It was like a 2016. Basically, I go in to this bar and ask if they have anything interesting. Typically, they tend to be leaning very much more natural, but it's one of those places where you go in and you tell them what you like, and they have 30 bottles open by the glass, and they pour you like 3 samples, and you actually get to pick. But there's no menu, so you don't actually know what they have. And then they have a sister restaurant it actually burned down, but they were able to save some wine, or they had wine elsewhere. So basically now they're getting more also traditional wines as well as these natural ones. They had a German Spätlese that I didn't know about, that I didn't order, which I'm still bitter about. But there was a Piemonte's wine there that was 2016. And it was really interesting because the guy poured it for me, and he's like, this is a Nebbiolo here. And I was like, I tasted it and I was like, wow, this is so rich, like not full bodied, but it was like very concentrated and not at all tannic and lean and purple fruits. And I was like, are you sure this is the opposite of your experience where the guy was like, this will go well and don't ask questions? It was more like, I immediately asked questions, guys, I don't know. And I went back and researched. So I went back and informed him after I got my next glass. And it turns out it was Dolcetto, Barbera, and Nebbiolo. It was just labeled Langhe as a whole, but it was a whole blend. And I was like, all right, great. I'm not insane. I was like, this does not look like a Nebbiolo. Like, it has great acid. So that was a fun experience.
I'm sure he appreciated that.
He does. He's actually the guy who actually pours. Well, 2 of them now. Like we've been going there so long that they actually ask me questions when I come, and they're actually earlier in their wine journey than we are. So I'm more of it's more of a buddy thing. They're really nice. Yeah, they like it when I tell them stuff. I'm not that kind of asshole who just goes around and corrects everybody everywhere.
Well, if you keep doing that, you might acquire like a 5% stake in this place if you're like the mentor mentee type thing.
Oh, the regular. Well, the guy was nice enough to give us a free glass of wine when we got engaged. But no, yeah, it's really nice. It's like our home base. But so I did a bigger tasting this week. It was a Burgundy tasting at K&L, another one of their setups, and they had 3 whites and 3 reds. But what was kind of nice is the wines ranged in price from, one was $50, but they ranged up to, according to this one, $600 a bottle. Not 100% sure on how they get all their pricing, but I guess that's the case. It's probably cheaper on the Vint Marketplace if anybody goes and checks. But yeah, it was pretty cool. So there were 3 whites. One was actually, you remember when we had either William Kelly on or like even Berghout or some of the other people, that they have this region called the Haute Côte de Beaune and like the Haute Côte de Nuit now.
Yeah.
Basically meaning like higher up on the hills, not necessarily those mid slopes that have been traditional. So the first one we had was from Etienne Sauzet, he's one of the most famous. He's a great wine producer, especially known for his white wines. We sell a lot of his stuff on the Vint Marketplace that I could never afford. But this was a $50 bottle of his Haute Côte de Beaune. And I thought it was fantastic. And I was like, this is what I've been asking people about, is as you move up the hills with the global warming, are you still going to get the full body, the richness? It was just like a very nice minerally lean white Burgundy. But then the other 2 I tasted were $189, $150 a bottle. So this one was like literally like a third or a quarter the price. So
value play.
Yeah. And it's a great producer though. It's getting like Chaves. Like it used to be getting like John Louis Chaves was a deal. And now that's even expensive, but like anything with like his name on it. So it's cool to find the producers who do a good job as they expand like where they're making wine. So that was cool. The other 2 whites we had were a Pliny Montrachet Combat. Le Combat, it's like a Climat within from Prière, which was really good. And then I had a Christian Moreau Le Clos from Chablis, which was also really great. It was cool to have those side by side because like the Pliny Montrachet was really delicate and less mineral driven than both the first and the last one, which was interesting.
The Pliny Montrachet was the $600 one.
No, that was $189 a bottle. Yeah, that one, according to on their website. Yeah, we're getting to the reds were where they got a little bit more pricey. So we had a Chevion, and the vintages on those were 2021 for the Haute Côte de Beaune, 2019 for the Pliny Montrachet, and 2021 for the Chablis Le Clos. So still young. All of these are going to be really young. So then the reds were also all 2020, which I think it's better to probably taste these in a longer time. It was hard to really do them justice, but one was Robert Chevion, Nuit St. George, just a VA bean. So it's like a base. He was a quality producer from an interesting area. The next one was Sylvie Esmonin, Gevrey Chambertin, Clos Saint Jacques, which is really exciting for me. One, I had many people reach out, including Josh from Vinovore, or not Vinovore, Vino Head, and be like, Sylvie, she makes a bomb wine. So it's number one, a producer that I didn't really know about. When I was at the tasting, the guy raved about her. So that was really cool to see. Second, for those who don't know, Clos Saint Jacques in Gevrey Chambertin is basically as good as most of the Grand Crus in Gevrey Chambertin. It was just not labeled a Grand Cru for a couple of reasons. I think one is because it borders one. It doesn't border a Grand Cru. I think one of the rules in Gevrey Chambertin is it had to border another Grand Cru to be a Grand Cru. There's like basically some weird stipulation that when they made the Grand Crus didn't allow it to be, but it's widely known as basically the second best vineyard behind Chambertin itself. That's up for debate for Bergheads, but so that was cool. So that was the first one I had ever had from Clos Saint Jacques, and it was really good. It was probably the standout of the mix. Like, even though it was 2020, it had a little bit of notes of development already, a lot of the forest floor secondary type stuff you might expect with minerality and also the fruit shining through. It was just a really complex wine, which was exciting. And then last but not least was a Domaine Trappé, which is another great producer. Their La Trissière Chambertin. So that was one of the Grand Crus in Chambertin. That was the $600 bottle one. And that just shows the difference between it was $279 for the Clos Saint Jacques, which was arguably, in my opinion, just as good. But when you get to the Grand Cru, it's $699, but also a great producer. That one was really well-made wine, really like delicate florals, a lot of all of what you would be looking for. But I think it was just so young that it's really hard to judge properly. It wasn't really showing much sign of development yet, which I don't think truly does the wine justice. I think the whites were cooler to drink young, but it was really nice to get a sense of some of these reds as well. So that was my exciting tasting for the week.
Nice. Yeah, I went the cocktail route while we were in Vermont. Had a few rye cocktails and things like that. They were really good. That's awesome. Yeah, I wish we had tastings like that around here. We don't usually break into that kind of stuff. I guess it's nice being in a big city with a K&L who can put on stuff like that.
Well, I didn't even know. I guess they didn't do this during the pandemic, so I never really thought about it. But it turns out, like Adam had mentioned, that when he was studying for his MW, used to go to these tastings in San Francisco. They even have more. And that was actually how he studied without buying all the wine. And I was like, oh, that is a great pro tip. I'm going to start pre-studying. It's cool. So shall we get to quickly what we're drinking and then finish our intro for the farm?
Yeah, what is the wine? Do you have your wine of the week?
Yeah, and it's just going to be a preemptive wine of the week this week is going to be David Keck's wine, Stella 14. It's not going to be a specific. I think when we put it in the newsletter this week, I'm just going to call it Vermont wine, and then we'll call out David Keck in particular. But basically, due to its climate, due to the area, a lot of these producers up here have been experimenting with hybrids. There are some native Vitis vinifera, not native. There's some Vitis vinifera, but there's going to be a lot of hybrids, a lot of stuff that can withstand the cold. A lot of stuff that ripens a little bit better. It can withstand some of the fungal and disease influences that are unique to Vermont. So I'm personally really excited to go down and try to taste some of those, maybe some co-ferments because it's a big cider area as well. And then Brady also just bought some. So we'll maybe in the coming weeks, he'll try some at his house and I'll try some while I'm out there and we can kind of circle back. But from what we've heard, they've got great reviews. And the one that we're particularly referencing made by a master sommelier. So can't go too wrong.
Yeah, it's awesome. I heard great stuff too from the merchant that I bought from in outside Burlington too about David and just, great things about David as a winemaker and as a person, but also about this project. So yeah, definitely excited about this.
Awesome.
Let's dive in and we can introduce Jim and Santiago and get our listeners to the interview. Like I said, This is something we've been working on for a little bit. I think every time I've talked to Jim about my allocation, in the fall and the spring, I've asked him to come on and we finally made it happen.
You want to note the wine that inspired him to reach out that you were waxing poetic about that people might remember?
Yeah, so at the farm in West Side Paso, they have Old Vine Cabernet is the oldest cab vines in Paso, I believe, and we'll talk about in the episode. But they also do some Rhone varieties and particular Grenache. The label is called The Dish. It was, I believe, 2018 vintage, which they do still have some of because have two more coming in my fall allocation. Really just blew my mind. Higher elevation out there in the west side, in the hills, Adelaide Hills, I believe, west side Paso, and just great minerality, the acidities there, the ripeness of the fruit. Really, like I had it in a red solo cup actually the first time I had that wine at Thanksgiving with I believe my mom's side of the family, that I was probably the only one there drinking wine. We had no glasses, poured into a red solo cup, and it still was like floored me. So I left half of it, had it in a proper glass later. Yeah, and I think it's just one of the very best wines I've had in the last 12 months, I'd say. So Jim Madsen is the one kind of running the day-to-day show at the farm in Paso, but his good friend Santiago Achával is the winemaker and consultant, and they're partners on the project. He also has his own project in Mendoza in Argentina, where they have their Matervini label. And so Santiago does both. And Jim, as you say, he's not the winemaker, but he does do some work in the winery as well. Yeah, it's a really great conversation with Jim and Santiago, who have projects that aren't massive, but they're making the absolute highest quality wine that you can make in very low quantities, and yeah, doing it successfully from my estimation.
Yeah. And just to add a couple just high level points. Yeah, they were nice enough. They sent me one of Brady's favorites of the dish, which I still need to try. And they also sent me this one, the Big Game, which is like their Cab, Syrah, Petit Verdot, and Malbec blend. But this was a 2014, which I had over the weekend. Excellent complexity. I think I need to let it just sit and open up even more. I Corv in this one because I was going to want to come back to it. But to Brady's point, I think what makes the farm unique is one, they're so focused. It's like micro vinification in terms of like their lots. This one is made in 263 cases, but basically they've sourced like the best in most interesting vineyards that they can find in terms of, especially with older vines. And they're really so focused on just expressing the wines in that area. Basically just trying to put all the work in. So basically that's why we were saying this is like a cult winery without the cult following or the cult price, is because these are small lots. The bottle and the packaging is like excellent. It feels just like any expensive bottle, but they're like in the 80s, I guess. But everything is so personalized. Like to your point, if you join the club, they were noting how you can make, each allocation exactly what you want. Like they'll have their list and you're not stuck with anything. I thought that was really cool. And they also are saving back vintages for people who discover the farm, maybe you who are listening, so they can access some of these back bottles. So that's so interesting. I'm just introduced and I get a 2014 right off the bat. I thought that was just really cool. They're really thinking from what they would want as a wine connoisseur or wine lover perspective on what they're offering everybody. So it's just great value and great wine.
Yeah, definitely my favorite producer in Paso, one of my favorite producers in California, and definitely break the top 10 of favorite producers I've had here stateside. High praise for the farm and both for Jim and Santiago, what they've been able to do there for me. Our listeners should check it out. Hope you enjoyed this interview with Jim and Santiago. Jim, Santiago, thanks so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you all on.
Hey, Brady. Nice to be with you today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This is my first time talking to Santiago. I've spoken to Jim a number of times, and I practically begged him over a course of months to come on and join the podcast. And so I'm glad we could find some time. And I hope, Jim, maybe you can give us a little bit of an intro about why we have both you and Santiago on today and how your relationship started in wine and actually even before wine, right?
Yeah, our relationship goes back to probably to a point you may not remember very much. The year was 1987.
Yeah, that's just before Billy was born.
Okay.
Thanks, Brady.
In 1987, September, Santiago and I met each other pushing toddler sons on a swing with one hand and a beer in the other hand. And we both discovered we were ambidextrous with the skills. The setting was married student housing at Stanford University. We had both arrived, my wife and I from Santa Barbara, Santiago and his wife from Argentina. Since we had kids, the university put us in married housing, which was shaped like a horseshoe, and the back of the townhouses emptied into this horseshoe courtyard where the kids could feed free range. And our wives were unpacking. We decided to get out of their hair, put our kids on the swings, and just started chatting. The housing was regardless of department, and we discovered serendipitously that both of us were going to be in the MBA program, which was a 2-year full-time program. And both of us were first-year students. So we were going to get to know each other pretty well, given that our 2 townhouses were only about 50 yards apart from each other. So that's where we met in 1980. And it's been a friendship now that's carried on for 36 years, a friendship that's carried on so much that Santiago is the godfather of our daughter. And all of his children's names are on the corks of the farm wine. It truly is a very great friendship intertwined over decades.
Exactly. And even though it started with beer, you said we didn't meet in wine, but we met with wine. So very quickly it went on to different kind of beverages and cuisines and cooking at home and many anecdotes like that.
So Santiago, were you making wine at that time that y'all met at Stanford, or was that something that came
No,
later?
that came later. Actually, the wine bug, I caught it during the MBA program on weekends in Napa, on weekends in Sonoma. I actually had nothing to do with wine at that point. My family was never in the wine business. I grew up far away from wine country in Argentina, so it was nothing to me. But it has, I'm not going to talk about it here, it has its appeal. Undeniable appeal at every level. And I caught it, and it's contagious, it's an incurable. And I was suddenly in the middle of students and professors that were encouraging each other to take a leap and find the passion and go on a limb and be entrepreneurs and say, okay, that's something I want to do.
In fact, Santiago was so far away from the wine world when he was getting his MBA that one weekend, my wife and I, who had lived in California, suggested that since there were babysitters for our kids this one weekend, that they join us for a weekend in Napa. And I'll never forget Santiago's response. What's a Napa? So that's the baseline for his wine knowledge.
Pretty low, yeah.
That's still a phrase to keep in the back pocket, because you're Central Coast winemakers, though, now too. And Paso Robles, you can stick it to Napa these days with that line. You had your shiny Stanford MBAs. Was it right to the vineyards, Santiago? And Jim, how did that, well, I won't make you talk over each other, but was it right to the vineyard for you, Santiago? And how did that happen for you, Jim? That happened later, right?
No, it wasn't right to the vineyard. In fact, I had a contract to fulfill because an Argentine company had paid for the MBA. So I needed to go back and work for them 5 years at least. I ended up working 6. I needed to make some money because financing is very difficult to get in Argentina. The first winery I founded 9 years after I left the MBA program.
That's pretty good. 0 to no wine knowledge to owning one and founding one in 9 years. That's pretty good.
Well, I don't mean to say that I knew a lot when I founded it, but I was lucky in my choice of partners. And one of them is an Italian winemaker, and he became my mentor. I had accumulated a lot of theoretical knowledge, book knowledge by that point, and he taught me all the practical knowledge, the sensibility and the sensitivity towards the vineyards and the grapes and their purpose, and getting into a dialogue with these live, the systems that are alive now. A good thing he's Italian, I always say, because they speak a lot and have good memory. It was a quick learning from then on.
When you were founded, were you owning vines as well as a winery, or were you just buying fruit at that time?
No, we actually bought vineyards before we built the winery. We were leasing a winery during the first years. It was these came in the middle of one of the recurrent crises in Argentina. And suddenly we had a few dollars that we were planning to use towards the building. And the vineyard started going on for cents on the dollar after one big devaluation. So we put all that money towards buying vineyards, mostly trying to buy old vine Malbec vineyards. And so the winery came 6 years after starting the project.
And then Santiago, sorry, Jim, was it 9 years for you? At what point did you get in the mix with the wine, in the wine business?
You can call me Santiago because my given name is James, and James in Spanish is Santiago.
Oh, perfect. Nice.
My background was as an engineer before business school, and I didn't envision doing anything but high tech when I graduated. And I was fortunate to join a little startup company in San Diego. Nobody had heard of. It's called Qualcomm, which happens to have the intellectual property and chips that go into every cell phone on planet Earth. And I joined it when I was a little startup of one building. And I ended up having a 20-year career in wireless technology, wireless spectrum, an early cloud computing company. And along the way, we had 3 children. And when the youngest of the 3 went off to university, my wife, I knew, was going to have a difficult time because she sacrificed her career to help the kids become the great people that they are. And we dropped our daughter off in Northern California. And I thought, rather than heading right back to San Diego, let's have a little husband and wife weekend. We're empty nesters for the first time after over almost 25 years of marriage at that point. This is 18 years after graduating Stanford. So we're 18 to 20 years, actually 21 years after Santiago and I had met each other at this point. So on the way back from San Diego, I thought, well, let's go to this place called Paso Robles. We heard it's got some up and coming wine going there, and it's pretty. It was September. So we had a wonderful couples weekend in September of 2008 in Paso. And we were on a winding road on Chimney Rock Road near where Justin is. And my wife said to me, hey, Jim, got a crazy idea. Now, I don't know about you guys if you've been married for a short time or a long time, but I knew that after being married for 25 years, that when my wife says, Jim, I've got a crazy idea, and she says it while I'm driving, there's only one thing to do, which is to pull over to a shoulder, put the car in park, turn off the ignition, leave the 3-point seatbelt on, make sure the airbags are working, and then turn to her and say, yes, dear. And she said, hey, I know we've got a new chapter in life now with all of our kids out of the house. And I know you like starting businesses. Let's start a winery. Now, in 25 years of marriage, how many times do you think we'd have had this conversation?
Either 1,000 or 0.
And it was exactly zero. You got the exact right answer, 0. And I said, honey, while we single-handedly have tried to support the worldwide wine economy, I think that's a necessary but not sufficient condition to start our own winery. And she said, well, that's okay. Your best friend is one of the world's greatest winemakers. And I said, but in all the years we've known Santiago, we've never talked to you about starting a business together. She said, well, then let's call him. Well, we discovered when we were having this conversation on the shoulder of the road, which ironically is within a half mile of where the farm winery is today. Talk about Kismet. One of the things we learned early on is where the grapes grow best, there's the worst cell phone coverage. So we had to drive 30 minutes into Paso Robles to find a signal, and I called Santiago, and it was a Sunday afternoon in Argentina. He didn't answer the phone. He said, hey guys, I'm cooking parrilla, barbecue for my 50 closest relatives, which is this intimate family gathering they do every weekend. He says, and the biggest sin in Argentina is not rooting for a Chilean soccer team. The biggest sin in Argentina is overcooking the meat. And so he said, I can't talk for long. And so he quickly busted out, hey, we're thinking about starting a winery in Paso Robles. Would you like to do it? And his response was so loud, we didn't hear it on the cell phone. Basically, it was an echo from the troposphere echoing down from Argentina to Paso Robles. And we're all now excited on this phone call. And it was like, well, what next? And within a couple of days, Santiago sent us a 9-page email of first things off the top of his head of 9 pages of a to-do list. We're going to start a winery. And so it was off to the races. And in September 2009, we were harvesting our first fruit and making our first wine. So we pulled it all off within less than 12 months of my wife's epiphany.
Yeah, one of the things Jim has, he does research like nobody else. And he found all the vineyards with I had a priority list. And he checked all those boxes and found beautiful vineyards, and then somehow convinced those growers and not to sell grapes. That would have been easy. The mission was to convince the growers to farm their blocks or those rows that we would take differently. And because we believe as the farm winery that the source of originality and difference and personality in your wines is your grapes. And the source of the differences between the grapes, it's in the farming. And he convinced all these people to give us credit that we knew what we were doing, to farm differently. And most of those vineyards we liked, a couple we didn't, but that's the case always with research. And after many years, most of the vineyards we have were in that first group.
Wow. So how did you convince them? Was it just, we will pay you extra if you farm lower intervention, or like, we don't want large yields, we want small yields? What was that conversation like?
Yeah, having worked in high tech, it was a very different mindset to work with growers. Turned out one of the things that was a big deal to them is, do people pay them for the grapes at the end of the season? And do they pay on time? This turned out to be like an incredibly big deal. It was like, given where I came from, that would have been like the last thing I would have thought about, which is accounts receivable being a differentiator for a vendor relationship. But we were able to show them that even though we were a startup, that there were going to be adequate means that we could back up our contracts. Santiago at that point had developed quite a reputation. I think the Wall Street Journal said in an article about his first winery in Argentina, it was the first cult winery in South America. And there were a lot of other accolades from across the wine publicity. And so when people sort of realized, yeah, it's a little startup, but they're trying to do something along the lines of the reputation developed in Argentina, that certainly opened doors. One of the key things we did financially was, that's different than buying grapes. We said, hey, Billy, let's say you had 9 rows of Grenache that we really wanted. We said, hey, Billy, how would you like a contract that will pay you more than what you expect you'll get for those 9 rows? And we'll pay you no matter what happens. If hail destroys the entire crop, you still get paid 100 cents on the dollar. You probably would say, okay, there's got to be a catch in here somewhere. And when our catch was, please let us farm those 9 rows of Grenache, which happens to be the 9 rows of Grenache, Brady, that's in the dish 2018 that you have behind you. What we said is, so we can farm those 9 rows of Grenache, we'd like to farm them as if they were on a property. And their biggest concern was, would we do perhaps long-term farm to the vines by doing something weird? And obviously we told them what the routine was in Argentina and what the results were. And so they quickly developed comfort to work with us. And then at the end of the year, we paid everybody 100 cents on the dollar, and we sent out the checks 2 weeks before they would due. And amazing how that, if you do what you're saying you're going to do, you can build great relationships on a handshake.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think one of these vineyards holds the oldest Cabernet vines in Paso Robles. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a vineyard on Peachy Canyon Road. It's called Old Bailey. And Old Bailey was planted in 1964. There's no records of even what rootstock it is. And we believe there is older in Paso Robles, but there is no older Cabernet Sauvignon vineyards. There's some that we know that are planted in 66, 67. But we think the Old Bailey vineyard, for which we've had 100% of the Cabernet exclusivity for those blocks 5 and 6. It's also got some Zin on it. But the Cabernet blocks, we've had exclusivity, and we've used that to make our flagship wine spelled Cardinal, different than the Napa Cardinal that has an E at the end of it. Ours is spelled Cardinal, like the guy in the Catholic Church, baseball team in St. Louis, or football team in Arizona.
One question I have to ask before we move on is it because Santiago is a native Spanish speaker that you guys properly in Spanish pronounce Paso Robles instead of Paso Robles like the locals?
Well, I'm actually a native English speaker. I was born in Rochester, Minnesota.
Oh, wow.
And I lived there until I was 6, and I didn't learn a word of Spanish until I arrived in Argentina. But yes, I grew up in Argentina. That's why we call it by the Spanish name.
I was going to say your English is also spot on. I can't even get an accent. So that explains all of those things.
Yeah, most of the time we
So
just
there's
refer to it as Paso. That's sort of the go-to. It is fun to hear people say, especially some of our guests who come visit, I can't wait to come to Paso Robles. Quite a range of pronunciation. Just as a side note, our winery name is The Farm Winery. But if you look at the small print on the back of the label, it says produced by La Granja Winery. La Granja in Spanish, it translates to the farm. So it was fun to have our corporate name be the translation of the DBA name. For a while, we thought we'd name our company, or the actual wine, La Granja instead of the farm. But we did a little quick testing, and 90% of Americans pronounce it La Granja. And I thought saying we buy some Cabernet from La Granja wasn't going to be the winning solution.
So I should know this because I buy your wines and have been familiar before this call, but so are there any estate vineyards? How many at this point, if there are?
Yeah. So the question of estate often comes up. It's like, do you buy fruit or is it estate? And estate, according to the government, means that it's grapes that's physically on your property or adjacent to your property. But the promise to the consumer by using the term estate isn't that technicality. It's that suggestion that you have control over it because it was on your own land. The hybrid model Santiago started off describing essentially is we are doing estate work, but on 7 properties within a 2-mile radius of the farm winery. We have a 160-acre property, and my wife at the beginning said, we're going to leave these 400-year-old oaks on the property and not cut down one of them. And let's work with old vines that are already out there rather than plant something from scratch. We sort of did the math of if we were to plant from scratch and then let the vines mature and then let the wines age, I'd be somewhere between Medicare and the jewel bucket by the time those vines got to be of that age. We have exactly 0 vines, the property of the farm winery on Chimney Rock Road, but everything we do is as though it were an estate because we manage every vine in our portfolio.
This is driven by the fact that older vines make better wine. All other things being equal, we love the older vines. The wisdom they bring into the wine, the nuances, the complexity, the balance they bring into the wines. That was the driving force behind finding the older vineyards and farming them in such a way that they could express what they can express. And so that's the idea behind this. Jim took me to Old Bailey Vineyard, and I think, was it early April of 2009? It was just the first days of bud break, so the buds were maybe 1 inch, 2 inches tall. And I already had the sense this is going to make one of our best wines, if not the best one. And just looking at the slopes, looking at the rocks, looking at these huge cordons, but looking at how even and balanced the spurs were. Because you can see from the spurs what the previous growing season has been. And those spurs were thick enough, but not too thick. So there was not excessive vigor. There were internodes from the first to the second bud were good, balanced. It means probably we wouldn't need to tip the shoots too much, or if at all. And all of those things turned out to be true. So it's a voyage of discovery and pleasure at the same time.
Sorry there. I was going to see if you were going to build on your estate question. So I guess where I wanted to go from there is when you guys were selecting your different, I guess, the varieties you wanted to work with, obviously you have a Malbec, which is an homage to some of the Argentinian Malbec. You have Cab, but there's a bunch of Rhone varieties mixed in, which I know like Paso is known for as well. How did you guys decide on this mix, or was it just purely driven by where can we find these older vines, and then we'll craft a wine based around that?
Great question. So I would say, as anyone who aspires to starting a winery or owning one of the cardinal rules to live by is make the kind of wines you love to drink yourself. And for us, it's Cabernet Sauvignon is, my wife said, my favorite varietal. I'm not going to push Santiago if Malbec or Cabernet is his favorite, but I would guess that those two varietals are his two favorite wines. We have a natural prejudice bias for Cabernet Sauvignon. And in fact, we make 3 pure Cabernet, different labeled Cabernets, and a 4th wine that is predominantly Cab. So 2/3 of all of our fruit is Cabernet. Regarding the rest, Rhone is probably 25% of our production. And it's really 2 grapes, Grenache and Syrah, the same vineyard, the 9 Rows of Grenache I mentioned to you, and then a block of Syrah. They both happen to be at the highest elevation Rhone vineyard in all of Paso, Robles. And I'll let Santiago talk about why elevation makes a difference, particularly with Grenache. But we did want to have it as part of our lineup because even though Cabernet is actually by tonnage the largest producing grape in Paso, there's an exception that Paso is Rhone country. And we wanted to have that as part of our lineup, but not have it be the dominant part of it. So what we ended up doing was producing a pure Syrah, which we call the red zone, a predominant Syrah and minority Grenache called Primal Screen. Its mirror image, which is mostly Grenache and some Syrah called Touchy Feely. And then a wine called The Dish, which we produce in some years. That's a barrel or 2 of pure Grenache. So with those 2 grapes, we've ended up with 4 wines. 4 wines sounds like a lot, but it's really a very small amount of fruit between. The Malbec happens to come from our next door neighbor. Literally, we're looking at it from our property, and it's a whole 0.44 acres of Malbec, which gives us the best 2 barrels a year. And then a touch of Petit Verdot.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite the mix. Santiago, I'd like to hear, I'm hoping that the elevation adds like some acidity or maybe slows the growth of Grenache since it's such a fast growing grape. And then I'd also like to hear your homage to the Petit Verdot there, because I know not many folks have a Petit Verdot heavy wine, and I know you guys have one.
Yes. Well, I want to add first on what Jim said, and your question is how did these wines come out? And remember the first year we did many micro vinifications, and these wines started to shape up on their own, I would say. When you have all these flavors in your head and you have this sense that one of them wants to go here, the other one wants to be together, they start on by their own weight and personality to shape into different wines. That's the best way I can describe it. And it started to make sense to us with our prejudices and our favoritisms. But the big voice there was the grapes themselves and the young fermentations themselves. And elevation is miraculous what it does sometimes to grapes. And in Argentina, we're working up to, 3,300 meters. That's 10,000 feet in some places with Malbec. And elevation gives you higher acidity, but allows you to ripen the grape up to a point in which that acidity is juicy, ripe, fresh acidity, not sour acidity. It also gives you better quality of sunlight. You're closer to the sun. There's less air filter. It gives you cooler nights. Cooler nights means, again, an extended ripening period. It means that the plant can turn off its metabolic paths during the night and go on again during the day. Elevation is something that we looked for because of the previous experience in Argentina, and it gave us all that we were looking for.
I'll let Brady hop in here in a second. I have one more on the elevation. So I know Argentina, the UV rays and the sunlight is stronger just because of how high the elevation is. Does Paso get high enough for that to actually make a difference, or is it more the diurnal shift and stuff like that?
Well, we can't make a control experiment in which turn one off and leave only one on. So I can't say which is which, but definitely it's a thing of degrees, and both of those work. And the elevation, as into temperature swings, and the same with closeness to the ocean, the flows of air through the Templeton Gap over the Santa Lucia range, all of those work. And definitely the air quality changes when you move from the town of Paso towards the Adelaida district and when you get onto the high vineyards. I think the answer is yes. to the question. All of the above.
Nice. Makes sense.
I want to talk a little bit about the farm winery as a business just for a few minutes, and then we'll move over and talk a little bit about Madrevini. There are two things that stand out to me that y'all do at the farm that has been, maybe three, that's been really different from other wineries I've purchased directly from. One is that you make almost no wine by winery standards, less than 100 cases for several of these bottlings. And one, you still manage to hold back a few wines. It seems like when I've gotten in touch with you, you're able to have sort of some back vintage available, which I think you do that sort of by design. And then you sell those wines at the same price later as you do on initial release, which I've never seen a winery maintain pricing for their back vintage wines as their original offer. Can you just speak to some of those decisions and pull back the curtain as much as you can on the farm, the business?
Sure. To partly answer your question about the pricing decision to not charge more for back vintages, I want to mention that at Stanford, they don't give letter grades, and you don't know where you stand in your class rank until the day you graduate. And on the day you graduate, they read off a list of students who are the top 10% of the class. Santiago's name was on that list of the top 10%. And if you were anywhere between the 11th and 99th percent of the class, your name isn't mentioned. But you can say that you graduated into the top 11% if your name wasn't mentioned, and nobody could ever prove you wrong. I guess since I was in that lower percentage, I missed the class on how to maximize profitability in pricing. And it's just, I got a poor return on investment for my business degree. The other possible answer is that why would you even have library wines? One possibility was it was a crap year and nobody bought them. A second is that you happen to have a year of a lot of wine and it's just happened to be a phenomenon of that one year. A third would be a deliberate strategy, which would be to say, every year there will be people who discover the farm winery for the first time. And it would be unfortunate that the only wines that somebody who discovers the farm winery in 2023 could ever taste would happen to be our current release, which right now is 2018. We actually hold our wines for about 5 years before we even release them. And wouldn't it be nice if somebody could have a wine that had 8, 10, 12 years of age on it, even though they happen to discover us this year? So we went about, when possible, to hold back some cases of our wines so that if somebody were to just learn about us through word of mouth this year, they could possibly get a wine that's from vintage 13 or 14 and understand what our drinking window promises of what a wine they buy today might be like 5 years from now. And the second part was that we have existing club members who might have discovered, oh my God, I love the Big Game 2016. How do I get more of it? And one of the most disappointing things is to say to a club member, I'm sorry, you can't buy any more. Or good news, you can buy it, but we're going to charge you 50% more than when you bought your first bottle. And that just didn't feel good to us to say to an existing club member, I'm glad you like the wine. Thank you for the privilege of us now being able to jack up the price 50% more so you can buy a bottle that has some age on it. So it's holding back some wines in the library for our club members is our way of saying, we really appreciate you supporting our family business. And these wines are here that you can circle back and try them again. And our cost of production was the same then as now. So our profit margin was the same then as now, leaving aside the cost of storage.
Santiago, I wanted to talk a little bit about Madrevini. You've mentioned some of this kind of obsession that you brought to the farm as well with old vines. I wanted to hear a little bit more about some of the decisions. What were you looking for when you acquired those initial vineyards? You said you were able to acquire them for pennies on the dollar. What were you looking for? And what are some of the maybe unique aspects of those Mendoza vineyards?
I think the primary driver of the search there was complexity. Complexity, which if your vineyard has terroir, becomes personality. And And it was all driven by the discovery early on in the first year of a very old, almost abandoned Malbec vineyard that then turned out to be our best and most highly rated wine across the story of Achával. And it was producing at such a low yield per plant. It was roughly, I don't know, a bit more than half a ton an acre at that point, maybe 0.7 tons an acre. And we would not have gone that low if we had not found this vineyard before. So the coincidences, luck, intuitions that you follow from very unclear signs, but everything was driven after that by this happenstance of having found a vineyard at very low yields, and a vineyard was making magical fruit at that point. So that was the start of the work. And across driving other vineyards down to that level of production, you need to do it in a balanced way, because it's no use to drop fruit if you're not going to balance the vine to a lower level of metabolic activity. And doing that, we found out as a virtuous circle that we were getting earlier ripeness, earlier phenolic ripeness. And we started harvesting with less sugar, with more freshness, higher acidities. And suddenly in the early 2000s, we were making medium alcohol to low alcohol wines with a lot of vibrancy and drinkability and freshness, alongside the terroir and the character and the complexity and the minerality. We found out by happenstance the kind of viticulture that once implemented ends up in a wine that has more personality, a bit less alcohol, more balance, more finesse, more elegance. So those were the lessons that I tried to bring across. But one of the things that was key to me is don't come with a recipe. Don't go into a vineyard of which you don't know anything about, of a location which you know, again, nothing about, and try to tell them how to do stuff. What we were trying to do is tell the grower what the goal was, and tell him how I had gone about getting that goal in Mendoza, and then ask him, what of these measures do you think will work on the west side of Paso in the Adelaide district at this elevation with this limestone and the soils? All of those things are different from Mendoza. So viticulturally, it had to be different. But the goal, the target was lower yields and a balanced growing canopy. And maybe we could get to the elegance, to the finesse and the complexity.
So the way that you pull those levers to get to that place, is that mainly work that you're doing in the winery, or is it just a matter of time and learning and understanding the blocks that you have when you're in the vineyard? How do you pull those levers to get to that place ultimately?
I think it's 90% in the vineyard. It's 90% in the vineyard. There's no way to create complexity in a winery, create nuances. You can do it some by blending, but if you're doing single vineyards, again, that becomes impossible. No, it's viticultural work. It's doing a severe shoot thinning in spring. So you end up with a very linear canopy, not a thick canopy that will have many leaves in the shade. So you maximize the number of leaves in direct sunlight with all the photosynthesis ability that direct sunlight gives you. A leaf in the shade has 15% of the photosynthesis of another leaf in direct sunlight. Then we work a lot with leaf in the fruit zone with care so as to avoid sunburn, doing it right, doing it early so as to avoid sunburn. But we believe that the tannin development is very much influenced by direct sunlight on the grapes when they're small, very small. We work a lot with green harvest. We leave only one bunch instead of two. Some Petit Verdots have 4 bunches per shoot. And we go, most varieties have 2 bunches per shoot. We leave one. And if the bunch is very big, we will even cut off the shoulder or the tip of that bunch. So we work a lot with yields so as to increase the area of a root system and of canopy that is working towards each pound of grapes on that plant. So those are the main drivers: direct sunlight onto the leaves, sunlight onto the bunches, and lower yields, severely lower yields. We are cropping maybe 1/3 of potential production, sometimes less.
Yeah, that's really the biggest lever that you can pull, I assume, in these vineyards, right? And there's just not many winemakers are willing to make that trade-off. Is that what you find, to be able to sacrifice that much of your yield?
Well, I find what it does, that takes your juice, therefore your wine, therefore takes that out of the playing field where everybody is playing. And therefore your wines become unique. And when your wines become unique in a good way, quality-wise, you're able to command a price point that more than pays for that sacrifice you made in the vineyard. Every time I find a young winemaker, when we talk about this, I tell them, you need to close down the cost accounting of your vineyard, so as to not know how much it cost you once you're scandalized. But I think that's the driver of uniqueness, of originality, and of quality, and of terroir character in the wine.
And I noticed too that on both the Madavini and on the farm websites, you'll provide drinking window charts for all of your individual wines, showing when the recommended drinking period is for each of the vintages that you release. Are there any other sort of, well, to me, that goes hand in hand with sort of this obsession with complexity, with holding the wines back at the farm for 5 years. Do you do the same in Madavini?
We have a bit earlier release in Madavini, driven a bit by the nature of Malbec and also a bit by the nature of the financial problems of Argentina. But other than that, I'd say the farming is mostly driven by the same imperatives, I would call them. Malbec has the tannin structure of Malbec is different. So the barreling is a bit shorter. We do 18 months for Malbec versus 24 to 27 for the cabs and for the rounds. But again, this is not by recipe. We do it by tasting. And we arrive to those 24 to 27 by just going to the barrel room with Jim and Asmina and saying, hey, this does not taste ready to bottle. And so that's how we found that a barrel aging period is tasted right to us to bottle at that time. And the same thing is how we drive it in Malbec, in Argentina and Mendoza. So it ends up being by trial and error, or just trial until you find the right spot for all those variables.
It's obvious that you have a great deal of scientific and sort of, I guess, theoretical knowledge on viticulture. But at the same time, a lot of these things that you're talking about in terms of the processes by which you make these decisions and how you selected your vineyards in the first place, it gives a sense that you really have a deep intuition, a strong intuition for how these wines are supposed to present themselves. And so I like the blend of sort of feel and the practical knowledge and also sort of the science behind viticulture. It seems like you brought those two things together really well in both of these projects. Is sort of when you think in your mind about, is winemaking 90% theory, 10% feel? Is it art? Is it science? How do you make an assessment on that?
Oh, it's a good question. I'd say you never stop using the science in the sense that you run the numbers, you run the lab work, but that only builds a frame. For example, at harvest, you run all the numbers every week and sometimes twice a week on the grapes, but the numbers only define a box. And the box is fairly big in the sense when the sugar is high enough and acidity is low enough that I could harvest and make a grade one. And that's the entry point into the box. And you leave the box when the sugars are too high and the acidity is too low. But that box is fairly big. Within the box, there's nothing that can tell you better than your palate. And it's not being codified yet. It's not being built. I think the machine that can do that, eventually it may be built. It'll be a sad day maybe for us. But within the box, it's your palate and your memory. And I think you called it intuition. I think intuition sometimes is just a big database. And that database allows you to make quick connections between one side of the database and the other. And that jump between those 2 points, we call intuition. So it's memory that I remember what went on during the growing season. I remember these flavors from other years or something similar to this. And therefore, I have a hunch to do that. But I don't think you can build intuition without experience. You don't have intuition without building up experience. And that's tasting many fermentations, drinking a lot of wine, and remembering.
I really like that. I really like the way you put that. It is the interesting thing when a lot of people get into wine or just wine tasting in general. Everybody's like, oh, it just tastes like this, or it's intuitive. You learned it. And I'm just like, well, you can't you're not just born with, or like just automatically one day you just wake up and you have intuition. So I love that idea of it's the culmination of all of those different elements. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yep. Yeah. I always tell people that knowing about wine is easy. You drink a lot and remember. And I get a laugh of that, but most people associate drinking a lot with not remembering, loss of memory. But it is that. That's something that I learned from Roberto, and it's something that we learned together with Jim and our wives. What the Paso flavors were, what the characteristics of these wines could be or not. So it slowly goes and slowly you accumulate something until you have the confidence to say it is that way and not that other way.
Jim, you have taken the role of managing the business of the farm, and Santiago has taken the role of winemaker, viticulturalist. How do those roles overlap for you guys, or are they more separated than I described, or are they more blended than I described?
Let me go in first. Jim and Asmina do the topping of the barrels, do the SO2 additions of the barrels. They do batonnage. We're all four winemakers. Yeah.
So it sounds like Jim plays assistant winemaker, maybe full blown winemaker at this point, or Santiago. But I'll turn it over to Jim and ask just how does the partnership work in terms of who's doing the day to day of the business at the farm, and Santiago is making a lot of winemaking decisions, I guess, from a consulting basis, while Jim's filling barrels. But just describe that partnership.
Yeah. So first, Santiago never was a quote unquote flying winemaker. He would come to Paso Robles and live with us from anywhere from 1 week to 6 weeks at a time. He was there in all the key decisions, which we found that there were 4 super critical periods in a year. One would be when bottling would happen for a previous vintage. 2 would be in the spring, where we would go through what the program was going to be with sheep thinning and other learnings from the previous year. The 3rd would be at Veraison, usually in early August. And then we would have this multi-stage cropping process. And then finally, harvest season, which would be the longest, which could be up to 6 weeks long. In the course of a year, Santiago was upwards of nine weeks in Paso Robles, and always the key times. The rest of the year, there's the day-to-day routine stuff that needs to be done, which you mentioned, popping barrels, taking in samples, and doing some pump overs and so forth. But one of the great discoveries of owning a winery is how much stuff that goes on that has nothing to do with growing grapes or making wine. And to have a successful winery as a business takes a lot more than just the love of wine. It's analogous to a person who loves to cook and somehow thinks they're going to have a successful business as a restaurant or get a Michelin star just because you like to cook. There's so many other things that have to go on, just starting with logistics of distributors and suppliers, finance, working with vendors. And then, so for the farm winery, my wife and I wear those hats. For Matravini, a key aspect of their strategy was to set up a wine club for Americans who visit Argentina. And we've modeled a wine club for Matravini for Americans very much on how the farm winery works. And the La Granja has an importer's license, a distributor's license. And so we manage the whole club for Matravini and their hundreds and hundreds of members so they can get the Malbec from Argentina twice a year. This time of year, everybody thinks about harvest, but I will tell you we're as busy with managing the Farm Winery Club and the Matravini Club right now because both wineries allow our members to absolutely customize their allocation. And when you're not trying to just mass produce 500 club orders to be identical, but if Brady wants something unique and Billy wants something different, then we treat each of one of you as an individual and customize that. It's a ridiculous amount of work, but at the end of the day, we exactly match people up with the wines that they seek to have. And that's pretty much falls on Asmina and my shoulders.
Well, and you do a great job of it because I've called you probably 4 times out of nowhere, and you've answered almost every time about either my allocation or wanting to change something up, or just I think this past time just shoot you an email to get some of Santiago's wines as well. And one of these days, I'm going to get out to those twice a year tastings that you do, which I'm sure are incredible. But I've also, maybe that's the 5th practice that I'd never heard, only having tastings twice a year. I think that's really special. You want to talk just briefly about what that's like?
Sure. Well, we have the farm winery has typically a May tasting and an October tasting. October tasting is available to sign up on Talk right now. And why do we only do it twice a year? Well, a couple practical issues. One is we're pretty much sold out of the wines that we have, other than, as we discussed earlier, what we set aside in our library. We have the tastings for existing club members who want to be with us, as well as taste the wines they're receiving. And for people who have heard about the farm winery, if you would like to taste it. But while we add members to our club each time, you don't have a lot of room to keep adding people. If we were open more weekends a year, it would be literally like pouring water into an already full cup, which wouldn't make for a good outcome. The second is we have no employees. One of our mantra from day one was be extremely hands-on in every aspect of what we do with the vineyards and the winemaking and the customer touch. And something's got to give. We only have so many hours in the day. And so for Asmina and me to do tastings 2 weekends a year, we can do a really good high touch experience for those 2 weekends. But to do it more than that would be really tough. So it's worked out well. And if you let people know months ahead of time, a lot of folks can make their plans accordingly. But doing it few and far between has, I think, served us well, because from the get-go, we really didn't want to do more than about 800 cases or 10,000 bottles a year. So my analogy would be we're like a restaurant that maybe has 8 tables, or that's the 800 cases a year. And maybe somewhere along the line, we got a Michelin star. And when we had to think about it, should we get a new spot and go from 8 tables to 30 tables? Or should we maybe see if it's possible to get a 1.5 or 2 stars? We knew we could potentially go down either path. We knew we couldn't go down both those paths simultaneously. And we made a very conscious decision that we'd rather remain that restaurant with 8 tables, 800 cases a year, but just try to make the best possible wine for the people who are part of our wine family. And I think that influenced Matervini to some degree when Santiago started successor to Achával, his first winery.
Well, I love that. I know there's so many companies, especially ones that don't necessarily have estate vineyards where they're bounded by literally what their vineyards can produce. They are always tempted to scale. So I really admire your guys' approach to just stick to the quality and stick to your rigorous kind of vineyard and winery approach. I think that's very commendable. And now Brady's been raving about your wines for a really long time. I can't wait to eventually try some myself, and I'll have to come up there next time I'm by, or hopefully I'm by in October or May or something.
Are you more a Rhone or Bordeaux guy, Billy?
Traditionally, I've been a Rhone guy, although I've been converted more recently.
I guess we were going to ask you when you're going to make your first natural wine, maybe a piquette or 2 out of the farm.
Let me go back to the earlier key learnings is when you start a winery, you make wines you love to drink yourself.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, this is great chatting with the both of you. And Santiago, like I said, really excited to get hands on your wines, because just in the first introduction that I had to, your touch in winemaking at the farm, I certainly think that there's some of the best wines I've had out of the Central Coast and even California. And therefore, definitely in my top estates here in the US that I've had so far. So really appreciate you guys coming on and spending the time.
I always say that talking about wine is the second best activity after making it.
Sorry that it took a while, Billy and Brady, to get here, but we were really aiming to be number 100. And We got pretty close with this episode, guys.
Yeah, we'll have our 100th episode here soon, and then we'll make sure to bring you guys back around for episode 150. But yeah, I hope it's not that long till we talk again. But
I love having your podcast while I'm, especially when I'm driving. So hats off the way you've been able to, the lineup that you have.
yeah, I appreciate it. We'll be in touch with you all again, and maybe we'll have you on separately as well in the future. We'd love to continue diving in. But best of luck to both of you in your pursuits this year and as harvest gets finished up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. And let's toast to all of that. What we said, salud, I would like to say. Salud to wine, to Paso, to Argentina, to friendship, and to this communication that comes with wine and the sharing comes with wine.
Thanks so much, Santiago. Bye-bye, y'all.
All right. That was our interview with the guys from the farm, Jim and Santiago. I hope everybody enjoyed their story and also their dynamic. Definitely go check out the farm online and get some of their wines. They're amazing. And I don't think they will be as, well, if Jim has his way, they'll be as affordable as they are for a long time. But, I think once people start finding out about these, they'll be much harder to get on their list. So get on while you can. And until next week, we'll be back with another episode. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.